Chapter 5, Environmental Systems and Ecosystem Ecology. The case study on this chapter is important because it is a classic example of a dead zone. And so this is in the Chesapeake Bay, which is by Washington, D.C. on the East Coast. You can see where it is here under the sticky note. And so they've been known for centuries for their oyster industry. And it collapsed because of overharvesting, which means it's like overfishing, except you don't fish for oysters, you harvest oysters. And habitat destruction, diseases in the oysters, and water pollutions with high levels of nitrate and phosphorus from agricultural fertilizers, animal manure, and stormwater runoff. So one of a common AP question is, where does excess nutrients come from in water? And these are some of the three main sources of excess nutrients. So there's a process called eutrophication, which creates a dead zone from excess fertilizers. And the largest dead zone in the U.S. is not the Chesapeake Bay, but it is the Gulf of Mexico coming down from the Mississippi River. We have dead zones all over the world. The biggest one, again, is the Gulf of Mexico, and then our case study is the Chesapeake Bay, but they do occur in California as well. On this page, also know the definition of watershed and hypoxia. Turn to page 106. So this is section 5.1. This is a review of feedback loops. You learn these in biology and some in chemistry as well. So a negative feedback loop in nature is good because it reverses a problem and enhances stability. In our bodies, homeostasis, where our bodies maintain a constant temperature and pH balance and those kinds of things, is a negative feedback loops in your body. So in biology, primarily studied homeostasis. In our class, we often study, though, the bad ones, which are positive feedback loops. So it's driven in a further direction. So that's what we mean by positive. Not that it's good, it's actually just keeps going forward. And so the glaciers melting and the examples down here at the bottom. So know this figure in caption and how melting glaciers can make it warmer, which melts more glaciers. Erosion is another classic example. Once roots kind of disappear, so some erosion happens and the roots of plants that hold the soil in place go away, then it's a lot easier for more erosion to happen and more erosion to happen. Cancer spreads exponentially, so you have a few cancer cells and they can multiply rapidly, some cancers. Human population growth, and then both positive and negative feedback loops play a role in our food webs. So this is going back to the last chapter. When you remove or you add a species to the food web, it's going to have consequences, either good or bad consequences to the web. And so you're going to have feedback loops with that food web. Going on to page 108. The definition of a watershed is anywhere that drains into a particular river. So our river is the Santa Clara River. So all our surrounding hills here in Santa Clarita and also in Piru and Fillmore, they all, whenever it rains, all that rain eventually drains into creeks, which feeds into the Santa Clara River. And so this picture here shows everywhere in green drains into the Chesapeake Bay via some of these rivers that say here. So everywhere a piece of rain hits or a drop of rain, it will fall into or eventually drain there. And so what is a watershed? Well, we define it by its area, so how big it is, which you can see in the map here, its length, its slope, so that's its angle, how what's the angle and how steep it is and how fast it will drain, so the slope of the mountains and hills. What type of soil is it? What grows in it? So that's the vegetation. And what are the watersheds that are next to it? So it's adjoining watersheds. So these are the things that we characterize a watershed with and as we describe the watershed. Know the definitions of runoff, know the definition of a watershed, and an airshed as well. And that's an area that produces, it's up here in your book, that produces air pollution. So we have this big long thing here with sticky notes, and you need to copy it all. They're all progressed here. This flow chart. So we're going to start with eutrophication. Well, I'm sorry, we don't start with eutrophication. This is the process of eutrophication. So first we have excess nutrients that we talked about in the case study. And they're from farm fertilizer or manure or urban sewage too. So this is our toilet water or our shower water. That's all our sewage, anything that goes down the drain. And they can have nitrogen or phosphorus. So both of these can cause eutrophication, nitrates or phosphates. So rain washes, so an example would be a farmer sprays its field with fertilizer. The rain, and not all that fertilizer is taken up by the plants. There's more than what's needed, so that's why we say excess nutrients. And so this extra that the plants didn't use, the rain washes it into rivers or lakes and eventually to the ocean. Now, eutrophication can happen in rivers and lakes too. It can also happen in the ocean. So all of these nutrients first cause a phytoplankton or algal bloom, sometimes what we call it. So all of your producers in water, they make tons and tons of copies because now they have tons of nitrates and phosphates, which they love. Well, what happens is eventually those nitrates and phosphates run out, and so these guys end up dying because now they're out of nutrients. So they die and decompose. Another thing that they can do is they can block the sun. So everything below it, underwater, may possibly die from the lack of sun. So that's one thing that an algal bloom can do, especially in a pond or a lake. All right, so eventually they're going to die, and the decomposing bacteria bloom. These bacteria use all the dissolved oxygen, creating a hypoxic or dead zone. The word hypoxic means no oxygen, and we have a dead zone. So this whole process is important. The part of this that students often forget is this part here. Students will write about this and say, well, excess nutrients get washed into rivers, eventually into the ocean, which causes an algal bloom, which uses all the dissolved oxygen and causes the fish to die. Algae and phytoplankton actually make dissolved oxygen. They're photosynthesizers. So they don't use the dissolved oxygen, they make it. It's these guys that are decomposing them when they're dead that use all the dissolved oxygen. So it's the bacteria that are consumers that are using the dissolved oxygen through cellular respiration. So don't forget that part. That's a common mistake. On this page, also know the definitions of these: lithosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, and ecosystem. Here's a lovely picture of this whole process of eutrophication. So the flowchart that we just made is described here as well. So this is a really good picture to study. Going on to page 110. So 110 starts with 5.2 ecosystems, and we have here a review of food webs and the energy that flows through food webs. So all energy in food webs comes from the sun. That's a test question. It all comes from the sun. And to producers first, and then up the food chain. That's from last chapter. We know this. Everything when it dies gets decomposed, and matter, so nutrients, matter gets recycled. Energy is released as heat. So it's lost to the ecosystem, it's released as heat. So this is the energy that's lost as heat. So all of these orange arrows show that heat loss. But matter is conserved within systems. So make sure you know this figure and caption. Energy is lost to the ecosystem because it transforms into heat, which is unusable. Matter is recycled in ecosystems. That's an important thing to remember. I don't have a sticky note here, but you should know the figure and caption for here as well. Gross primary production is the total rate of photosynthesis in a given area. That's a definition you need to know. So that is, I'm going to flip over here to the first page. That's all of this energy made by your producers. That's GPP. What's available to the consumers is our NPP. So our net primary productivity. It's the rate of energy storage by photosynthesizers. So they're going to, the photosynthesizers, our producers, are going to make energy from the sun. They're going to make sugars. That's their primary goal, is to make sugars. Their goal is not to make oxygen for us. Now, that's lovely. We need that oxygen, but that's not their goal, because oxygen to producers is a waste product. Their goal is to create sugars, to create mass, biomass. So whatever sticks to their bodies is their biomass, and that's what NPP is. So storage is their bodies, and this is after respiration. So 90% on average is lost as respiration. And so the net primary productivity is the amount available to consumers. And so here's our simple equation that you do need to memorize. We measure this in energy per unit area per time. So an example would be kilocalories per meter square per year. So the average is 10% of GPP. So 90% lost, 10% is the NPP. So on land, net primary productivity increases with increased temperature and increased rain. So your biomes that are the hottest and the wettest are going to have the highest NPP, which you can see down here. Land biomes are green, and the top land biome is right here. It is tropical rainforest, and it's the hottest and the wettest. In the ocean, the more light and nutrients you have, the higher the NPP. So our algal beds and reefs, so these are like the kelp forest and our coral reefs, have the most nutrients and the most light, and they're going to have the highest net primary productivity. We sometimes just call it productivity. So if a question asks, which biome has the most productivity, we are referring to NPP, net primary productivity. We'll continue with the next video.